A very warm welcome to everyone. We're all here for the presentation of a really important piece of work, which was compiled by a very dedicated team of experts from every region of the world. The title of this report is Reshaping Policies for Creativity, Addressing Culture as a Global Public Good. It's beautifully illustrated throughout and packed full of high-value content. And it's going to be published today in English, in Espanol, and en français. The report is part of a 4-year UNESCO project called Reshaping Cultural Policies for the Promotion of Fundamental Freedoms and the Diversity of Cultural Expressions, and it was funded by the government of Sweden. I would now like to introduce Ernesto Ottone, the Assistant Director General for Culture here at UNESCO. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Your Excellency, Janet Gustafsdotter, Minister of Culture of Sweden, Excellencies, distinguished participants, dear friends. Well, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the launch of the UNESCO Global Report, Reshaping Policy for Creativity, Addressing Culture as a Global Public Good. Thank you for being here with us today. This is the third edition of the Global Report, which was first published in 2015. Since then, it has evolved into a key overview of the current state of the cultural and creative sectors. There are a few aspects that make this third edition on the report especially valuable. For one, the report has never been so inclusive. The new edition reflects policies and measures from 94 parties to the 2005 Convention, which represents almost 2/3 of parties. This shows the commitment of countries to report on the implementation of the Convention, despite the exceptional circumstances of the past 2 years. Civil society is also more present than ever in this report, thanks to a more participatory periodic reporting process established in 2019. This report addresses not only the governance of the cultural and creative sectors, but also their deep links with health, education, and the environment. The report also provides a truly global analysis of the effects of the ongoing COVID-19 crisis on the creative ecosystem. Dear friends, the new Reshaping Policies for Creativity also highlights important data that should be a wake-up call for policymakers. For example, while world exports of cultural goods and services doubled in the last decade, public investment in culture has declined. Culture and creativity account for 6.2% of all employment, and yet creative professions remain unstable and often informal. Although culture and entertainment are major employers of women, we continue to see big differences, with less than 1/3 of national art prizes globally going to female creators. Excellencies, Excellences, les grands défis s'accompagnent également de grandes opportunités, des opportunités de repenser la façon.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the major challenges we're seeing are also great opportunities to rethink the way cultural and creative sectors work for creators, the public, and society as a whole. This is no normal time, and therefore UNESCO has mobilized all of its efforts to support governments and cultural stakeholders to design policies and measures to protect and promote the diversity of cultural expressions. At the United Nations level, in May 2021, UNESCO launched the Interagency Platform for Culture for Sustainable Development, and some of its members are here today among our panelists. The aim was to strengthen collaboration and maximize coherence in action undertaken by the United Nations. The Secretary General of the United Nations has called on societies to identify the public goods they deem the most essential and to which they are the most attached, and to think about the best ways to deliver them. All players in the field of culture, institutions, but above all artists, professionals in the cultural fields, and citizens must ask themselves if they wish to see culture included alongside health, information, economy, and science.
Culminate in September at the UNESCO World Conference on Cultural Policies and Sustainable Development, Mondiacult 2022, to be held in Mexico. 24 years after the UNESCO World Conference on Cultural Policies for Development, held in Stockholm in 98, and 40 years after the first Mondiacult in 82. I hope that the new global report will provide valuable data and analysis that will contribute to these conversations. I also hope it will raise fundamental questions about the cultural ecosystems we want to best serve creators and everyone who find inspiration or solace in culture. Let me only reflect for 2 minutes. Et je vais changer au français.
I'll now switch to French. Over the past 2 years, we have seen that we need to rethink cultural policies. And this is essential because all of those who take part in the value chain for sustainable development and cultural sectors as a whole, we need to understand that a change is essential. And over the past 28 years, we have had cultural policies in place that need to be changed to ensure dignity, integrity, and fair remuneration of stakeholders. And this cannot be achieved through institutions alone. Artists have proven this during the Resiliart movement and in the standard-setting instruments of the 2005 Convention. This shows us that it's time for change. It's no longer a discussion between the South and the North or the South and the South. It's a global discussion. This pandemic has affected all of us. We hope that this document will be read with all of the attention that it deserves, and that it will lead to structural changes in the cultural and creative sectors worldwide. I hope that the discussions we hold today will allow us to reflect on how our states parties will be best able to address the challenge ahead of us and to introduce a change that is demanded by artists worldwide and all of those who work in the cultural sector. Thank you very much.
Point to end on a lovely overview of the report and the issues at hand. Assistant Director General, thank you very much. Please come and join me on the stage. Now, the report is the result of 2 years of hard work, of course, much of that during a global pandemic. It's been made possible thanks to the support of the government of Sweden. And I would therefore like to hand over to Sweden's Minister for Culture, Jeanette Gustafsdotter. Thank you very much, Minister.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Dear Assistant Director General, dear Excellencies, colleagues, dear friends sharing my interest and passion for culture. It is my great pleasure to be with you here today as we launch the 3rd edition of the UNESCO Global Report, Reshaping Culture Policies for Creativity, Addressing Culture as a Global Public Good. The report at hand is unique in its kind. In this report, data points out emerging trends in cultural policies at a global level and suggest recommendations to foster cultural and creative ecosystem. It is the only global report that provides an overview of cultural development worldwide. At the same time, it monitors state actions to protect and promote the diversity of cultural expressions. This report isn't just another report. A report like this takes commitment, ambition, and frankly, a lot of hard work. Therefore, I would like to extend my heartfelt thanks to ADG Otone and his entire team at UNESCO. As Minister for Culture in Sweden, I am very proud to represent a government that puts artistic freedom and gender equality at the top of the agenda. It is my hope and conviction that this report will help us all make better decisions. And better informed decisions are something that the global community especially needs at this point in history. The past 2 years have been very tough, not least for people working with culture. We have seen cultural institutions closing down, artists and cultural workers losing their jobs, and in some cases, artists being deprived of their social and economic rights. At the same time, we as citizens, communities and decision makers have been reminded of the importance of culture for our well-being. The importance of culture for society is fundamental, especially in times of crisis, worries, and sorrow. The right to freely participate in the cultural life of the community and to enjoy the arts is manifested in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This right is accompanied by the right to freedom of expressions, including artistic freedom and freedom of information and communication. The important role that culture plays in our society, the intrinsic value of culture and the importance of diversity of cultural expressions cannot be underestimated, in particular not when recovering from the pandemic. This report includes data from what we have experienced during the pandemic. We can use this data to learn and in turn enhance the implementation of the 2005 convention. This data will be crucial. The monitoring framework of the 2005 convention puts a particular focus on gender equality and artistic freedom. Gender equality, freedom of expression, and artistic freedom are key dimensions when promoting human rights and protecting fundamental freedom. Equality creates creativity, and creativity is the foundation of a thriving culture. I was very pleased to read in the report that gender equality is increasingly being recognized as priority for the culture and creative industries. At the same time, many challenges still remain. A worrying trend shows in the report is that attacks on freedom of a worrying trend shows in the reports is that attacks on freedom of artistic expression continued to rise in 2020. On the other hand, we can see that labor protections has been improved in many parts over the world, for example, through ensuring social welfare for artists. Ska jag gå dit? I would like to conclude by encouraging us all to promote the uptake of this report's finding among relevant stakeholders. Thank you for your kind attention and for inviting me to speak in this important launch. Thank you so much.
Minister, thank you very much, both for your words and of course to your government for making this project possible. Now, over the last 4 years, UNESCO has worked closely with 16 developing countries from different regions of the world. Together, we have developed ways of monitoring a very wide range of policies which impact culture and creativity. This project demonstrates that policy is not just a matter for cultural policy makers, and that issues linked to culture and creativity are also about fundamental freedoms and human rights, sustainable development, and much, much more.
Imagine life without art, a world without creative expression, the things that color our reality and give it meaning, gone. Working to keep culture and creativity alive, UNESCO's 2022 Global Report, Reshaping Policies for Creativity, monitors the world's progress in implementing the 4 goals of the 2005 Convention, an international framework that protects and promotes diversity while also addressing the challenges developing countries face. Governance for Culture highlights the importance of policies and measures to protect and support cultural and creative sectors, just as other sectors are protected and supported. Culture and creativity make up 3.1% of our global GDP and 6.2% of all jobs, not to mention the enormous value they create in building culturally rich and cohesive communities. And yet, public funding for these sectors has declined over the past decade. It's still not easy for people to make a stable career in culture or creativity. And the sectors were especially hard hit during the COVID-19 pandemic. Despite this, demand for creativity is growing, with online consumption soaring. But current business models don't pay creators enough, nor do they promote diverse content or adequately protect the use of online copyrights. Uneven access to the connected world is also deepening inequalities in cultural and creative sectors. By improving collaboration between governments, civil society organizations, and creative businesses, we can address the disconnect between the artistic works we love, the opportunities we get to see them, and the well-being of those who create them. Our rich cultural diversity should be preserved and celebrated across our world as the common heritage of our humanity and any imbalances addressed. That's why we need to ensure a fairer flow of cultural goods and services across the world and increase mobility for artists. More artists, works, and ideas need to travel to other countries, reaching the largest audiences possible. When public funding is limited, NGOs and other associations can help, but opportunities remain uneven. Funding and visa barriers make it harder for artists from developing countries to travel. And currently, most artist residencies are in Europe and North America. Access to global markets is just as uneven. While the export of cultural goods and services doubled in value between 2016 and 2019, 95% of total creative exports in cultural services still come from developed countries, and they receive 70% of all foreign direct investment. To address these inequalities, developed countries need to broaden trade opportunities for developing countries, offering advantages to them without requiring reciprocity. As no country can address rising global inequalities on its own, international cooperation is needed and is key to including culture in sustainable development. But international cooperation funding is going down. While the enormous value of culture in sustainable developing planning is increasingly being recognized. However, the value of cultural and creative industries specifically is still largely ignored, and their potential remains untapped. A single artist's work can impact the lives of millions, changing minds and behaviors. Yet, the contribution artists are making in critical areas such as climate action and environmental sustainability is largely overlooked. We need to make it grow. We must also protect freedom of expression and creativity for artists, and the rights of artists. While more countries are taking steps to improve economic conditions of artists, they are still far from enjoying the same rights as other workers. Violations of artistic freedom are also rising, and almost half of all countries lack independent bodies to monitor these harms. And though culture and entertainment is among the sectors with the highest employment of women, gender equality remains out of reach. In many countries, women are still being left out of leadership roles, and there is little support for change. So, how do we move forward from here? Supporting the cultural and creative sectors is important for all of us. Creativity inspires and helps us navigate life in all its complexity, at all ages. Creative minds are also key to solving the challenges of our world. We need to create better conditions for artists and cultural professionals and ensure adequate policies are in place so that culture can realize its full potential as a global public good benefiting all. And we need to act now as the world recovers from the COVID-19 pandemic. Let's start shaping tomorrow's priorities with our diversity of creative voices for a more sustainable future, leaving no one behind.
Welcome back. A really nice summary there for us about the main themes and ideas in the global report. Now, I'd like to introduce our first panel of guests who will now shed light on the processes undertaken over the past 4 years, both in the project's partner countries and here at UNESCO to produce this report. We're very pleased to have with us today Salwa Abdelkhalak. She is the fondatrice et directrice générale du Centre international pour l'économie culturelle numérique à Tunis. Next, we have Juliana Akoyo. Juliana Akoyo, who currently holds the position of Director of Gender and Community Development at Uganda's Ministry of Gender, Labour and Social Development. Next is Jordi Baltar. Jordi is the lead editor of this global report. Next is Yari Kamara. Yari is a policy researcher and one of the authors of the global report. And finally, we have Biggie Samwanda, Director for Arts, Cultural Promotion and Development at Zimbabwe's Ministry of Youth, Sport, Arts and Recreation. Thank you all for being here today. Now, just a reminder, this is a live event, of course, so after 2 rounds of questions, there will be a chance to put additional questions to our experts from people following this event online. If someone in the audience would like to ask a question, please use the chat function on the platform you're using. That's either Zoom, YouTube, or Facebook. Our chat moderators in the team here will in turn share your questions with me. Now, before we go to questions, a bit of context. As UNESCO's Assistant Director General for Culture just reminded us, this global report and the ones that preceded it are grounded on national reports submitted every 4 years by parties of the 2005 Convention on the protection and the promotion of the diversity of cultural expressions. In total, 151 parties have signed the convention. As we'll hear, these national reports are much more than a simple administrative procedure. They provide countries with an opportunity to assess the state of their cultural and creative sectors. Public authorities and civil society can use the process to discuss and share ideas and ensure that responses to challenges are built together. So let's find out more about the power of information sharing and participatory policy processes and go to our panel. So the first question is for you, Jordi Balta. Thank you very much. You have been the lead editor of this report, so thank you for your work so far. But also, as a member of UNESCO's international pool of recognized experts in this area, you have experience of how country reports are prepared, for example, in the case of Senegal. Can you give us an overview of how these national reports feed into and form the analysis at the international level, which we are, of course, publishing now in this global report?
Yes, indeed. And hi, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. So as the Assistant Director General mentioned earlier, the global report that we are presenting today has taken into consideration 94 national reports submitted by countries that have ratified the convention. That figure, those 94, is the highest of any of the 3 global reports published so far. It should be noted that this is not the only source used for the global report, because the authors of chapters have also drawn on research reports and articles, statistical data, interviews, case studies, and other sources. But national reports are an essential source without which this global report would not exist. I think this also exemplifies the importance of information and data for improving policies for culture. We need information in order to understand the needs that exist within cultural and creative sectors, to monitor trends, and to evaluate the impact of policies and measures. And at the global level, the global report also provides quality information in order to identify best practices, to transfer knowledge, and to set priorities for the future. I think it's also important to say that the preparation of the national reports is very illustrative, because the composition of the national teams somehow operates as a microcosm of the governance and the meaning of the convention. Because in each national team, you have a combination of different ministries and public bodies, so not only those in charge of culture, but also the ministries in charge of foreign affairs, international trade, sustainable development, gender, education, economic development, or digital issues, as well as civil society organizations and local and regional authorities. So the global report brings together evidence from many countries, as well as from the many voices that are essential for the diversity of cultural expression.
Jordi, thank you very much. We'll go next to Yari Kamara. You're a member of the editorial team that prepared the 2022 Global Report. Like Jordi, you wear 2 hats. You were also involved in the preparation of Burkina Faso's national report. How much of a challenge is it to demonstrate the contribution of culture and creativity to sustainable development?
Thank you, Tom. As Jordi has alluded to, at the national level, a key strength of the 2005 convention reporting processes is that it forces policymakers to take wide and cross-sectoral views of the place and the contribution of culture in development. In some countries where there's more siloed approaches to policymaking, you do have difficulties for data collation and, of course, upstream for integrated policymaking. But encouragingly, we're also seeing, and this has been encouraged by the 2005 convention, alongside with the holistic vision of the 2030 agenda, we're seeing some countries adopting whole of government approaches in which the culture sector is seamlessly integrated into sustainable development strategies. So for instance, Germany's 2021 Sustainable Development Strategy, which is the opening case study in the chapter on culture and sustainable development, is a good example of that. Encouragingly, we're also seeing in the voluntary national reviews that countries submit, the reports that countries submit to monitor progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. We see countries using many different pathways to integrate culture on action in education, in social inequality, in gender equality, and so on. But one of the stumbling blocks that countries face is that despite the 2030 Agenda's holistic vision, there are few explicit targets on culture in the SDGs. So for instance, Palau in its VNR report highlighted the fact that it felt that the synergies between culture and sustainable development were not sufficiently explored. And similarly, the EU, the European Union, has commissioned an expert group to work on exploring how culture can be better integrated in the VNR reports. So perhaps to sum up the challenge at stake, I will borrow a quote from the 2020 UNDP's Human Development Report, which exhorts societies to transition from valuing what they measure to measuring what they value. And that is a learning process that is still ongoing.
Yari, some great positive examples there of best practice and a sense of the challenges that we face in this area. Now let's bring in Biggie Samwanda and Juliana Akoyo. Your respective countries, Uganda and Zimbabwe, are among the 16 partner countries on this project. You also are both responsible for information sharing with regards to your country's measures to protect and promote the diversity of cultural expressions, both at the national and international level. Juliana Akoyo, Uganda's involvement in this process for the first time in 2020 must have been particularly challenging in the context of the global pandemic. Yet your country managed to organise extensive regional consultations and gather information for the submission of a very comprehensive first report. How did your country set up such an inclusive process? And what was the role of the Resiliart movement in enabling dialogue, especially with artists and civil society?
Thank you very much, Tom. What Uganda did is to organize a list of mapping of all the stakeholders, both in the public, private, CSOs, and in the academia, and using the criteria of all the domains that fall under culture and creative industry, and then also looking at the target groups in view of the young people, the men, the women, the persons with disability, and then also the indigenous minorities who are often left out of development and contributing to decision-making processes. So we established a task force of 25 members representing all these various levels of participation. And we also organized a training session of 3 days to take the task force through their roles, the frequency of reporting, and how they can collect the information that is needed for this report. But there was also serious consultation online where we are asking persons to contribute towards telling us which of the information they can provide as far as the goals are concerned. But there were also physical meetings that we organized. And whenever we got a challenge of non-response, we would make one-on-one calls to the people and also send emails to them so that we are able to feed into the data. The strength of this is it helped us raise awareness through a national dialogue, and especially through that national dialogue, there was social media, which passed on the information where we are saying come and support the whole process. And thanks be to God, under the National Development Plan 3 of Uganda, government had already discouraged government agencies working in silos. So what helped us is that we would tell the agency that, you know, this is a country report. So you are supposed to contribute as a country and not only as a ministry responsible for culture. In terms of the Resiliart, we'd like to appreciate that immediately UNESCO launched the Resiliart movement. Uganda took it up and was the first country to organize the Resiliart on the 16th of April, 2020. We'd like to say that the Resiliart was the first virtual space that the artists and the government were able to use to freely air out their views in terms of the challenges they are getting through as COVID ravaged the country. And through this Resilient Art, it brought on both the Ugandans nationally and also Ugandans outside the country. We had the case of an officer from New York participating, and we also had a designer from America. Secondly, the Resilient Art helped the artists to lobby in terms of ensuring that they get the stimulus funds, and also in terms of creating a cluster separate from the cluster of tourism. Under what we call a private sector foundation, there used to be a cluster for tourism where culture and creative industry was just a part. But through the lobbying skills that they learned through the Resilient Art, there is now a cluster which is called the Culture and Creative Industry Independent Cluster. Then the third one was knowledge was gained. Many people learned more about the policies that are affecting their promotion and protection of culture. They also learned the need to strengthen the sector through good governance, and also how to use the digital platforms to market their products. And then finally, it strengthened of the stakeholders so that we are able to contribute to the sector. Thank you.
A great insight into some of your successes in compiling your national report there, Juliana. Thank you very much. All three contributions so far, brilliant. We're going slightly over time. I remind all of our contributors, please stick to your allocated time. We can't go too much over time for this live event. Let's go to Biggie Samwanda now from Zimbabwe. Your country has extensive experience at monitoring and reporting on policies for creativity since your first national report back in 2016. What are the lessons learned from this experience, and how did that inform the way you compiled your second report in 2020?
Thank you, Tom. As Zimbabwe, we learned a lot of lessons in as far as participative policy development and even policy monitoring on creative and cultural sector is concerned. The first thing that we learned was that we needed to bring in government buy-in from the executive at the highest level. And it's something that we did, and it helped us as we saw His Excellency launching the National Arts and Culture Heritage Policy. We also learned that we needed to continually support women creatives, not just in the creative and cultural sector, but also as participants that come in to shape policy frameworks that we'll be doing for the cultural and creative industries, and also to inform on the quadrennial periodic reporting. So it became an exercise that we learned that we needed to do mobilization of women, whether they are creatives, whether they are cultural experts, whether they are coming from ministries within government. We needed to bring these to the fore. And that also informed and shaped what we now later went on to do in the preparation of our second periodic report. We also learned that we needed to put or to have an arts and culture heritage policy in place. It was in the first one, first quadrennial report, we didn't have that. Besides the arts, culture, and heritage policy, we also realized that we needed to come up with strategies for the sector. So we came up with the cultural and creative industries strategy for 2020 to 2025, which means we were learning from the idea of making sure that we are reshaping our policies for creativity in Zimbabwe for the sector, and also sharing from amongst ourselves in Zimbabwe and those in the South-South cooperation, these best practices. So it was actually instrumental in how we came to do our second periodic report. Thank you, Tom.
Another great insight there. Thank you very much, Biggie Samwanda. Let's now go to Samwa Abdelkhalak. Vous dirigez un centre dédié à l'économie créative numérique.
You are leading a center for the digital creative economy, and we've heard just how important it is to involve different sectors in defining and following support measures for creativity. Could you explain which place your center which role your center plays? It was founded in 2019 at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Which role does it play in the creative economy, and how does it work in an interdisciplinary manner to respond to the creative challenges in the digital era? Thank you very much. Good afternoon. The Center for Digital Economy of Tunis is one that was founded to address a need and the awareness that there are major challenges facing creative and cultural industries in our country, and particularly in its relationship with other cultural fields in other countries. It provides added value, and it showcases that added value on several levels: the social level, economic level, in particular. It's also based on the fact that it can foster youth employability. It can also foster education. You can teach through and by education. And this has been reinforced in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. A pandemic which has highlighted certain aspects demand and supply has decreased in all sectors, even though the cultural sector is increasingly developed. And in order to meet demand, you need content. We've seen that cultural and creative industries that use digital tools are not always able to meet demand. And that's why our center is an essential player in addressing this situation, as it brings together all of the different links within an ecosystem, working with heritage and cultural content, digital content in education, and we also work with higher education institutions, economic institutions, and other establishments in order to foster networking among the various sectors, but also among the different regions in our country. And this networking allows us to develop the added value of the center in the field of culture, and particularly when it comes to gender equality. Promoting women's empowerment in the field. So we are working at the forefront.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting.
Director General for Culture, Ernesto Arponi, back in here. What have you heard about participatory policymaking just now, and how UNESCO fits into the work in this field that sort of really stands out for you?
Il faut prendre en compte que les systèmes de
Well, it is
monitoring
important to take into account the fact that the monitoring systems that were established have very clear objectives. First, the implementation of a convention, and secondly, the monitoring of the national policies. But when we look at all the work undertaken to compile this report, all the analytical work undertaken, it helps us really to find the answers to the fundamental question. How can we, on the basis of the differences on the field, how can we then identify perspectives for change in these countries? And I think that what was done in the past 4.5 years, it took us a bit more time than previously anticipated because of the pandemic. So what we try to do is to integrate all the changes. And this is what makes this report so rich. It's much more richer than what we thought it would be. Without the civil society, without research centers, without focusing on the fundamental need for comparable data, without all that, it will be extremely difficult to provide our member states with answers. And by listening to our experts, I can say that the time has come to go beyond reporting and monitoring for each convention. I think the time has come to compile a global report, bringing together all the conventions of culture in order to identify global answers to global issues. The different conventions were designed in order to meet specific demands, but today they're all necessary in order to provide a global answer to all our member states.
It's been a really difficult time, but there have been some lessons learned, as Ernesto Ottoni was just outlining there. We're going to our second round of questions from the panelists now. I plead with you all, please, just a slightly shorter answers, really interesting stuff, but just slightly shorter this time to help us get within time. Back to you, Jordi. This global report, the 2022 edition, reveals that the collection of qualitative data on the cultural and creative sectors has improved. However, quantitative and statistical data remain a major challenge. In your view, where are the major gaps and how could countries fill those gaps?
Yeah, I think as the previous contributions have shown, improving policies and measures for diversity requires better information, and that includes both qualitative and quantitative data. In particular, we need quantitative data in order to better assess the needs of cultural and creative sectors, to observe trends, and to compare situations in different contexts and countries. So if we look, for instance, at the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, the scarcity of quantitative data in many countries has made it difficult to be able to assess the impact of the crisis in terms, say, of cultural employment, of the economic value of the cultural and creative sectors, or of the general participation of the public in cultural activities. And when we compare these with the situation in other areas like education, health, or the economy, we observe there is a gap here because those areas are better equipped with indicators and therefore can better analyze the needs and develop policies and strategies that are suited to those realities. So there is a gap here that needs to be filled. How could this be done? I think firstly, by developing more standardized international indicators and methodologies to support the collection of data. Secondly, by moving from isolated impact assessment studies to more permanent cultural information systems. Thirdly, by making these a priority in international and regional collaboration, so supporting the transfer of knowledge and the development of expertise. And finally, in the long term, it's important for culture to be given a more prominent role in global agendas on sustainable development, because that will imply also that more attention is given to the collection of data in these areas.
International cultural cooperation. You point out that only 0.23% of development aid is allocated to culture and recreation. Why is development aid linked to culture so low, and how can that be addressed?
Yeah, I think the narrative of how culture drives development is a complex one. And therefore, perhaps the sector tends to be deprioritized in development aid for actions that have clearer and simpler, more direct theories of change. Now, we saw a sharp fall already in the minimal part of ODA dedicated to culture and recreation after the 2008 financial crisis. So there's a real risk that following the COVID crisis, we see another fall. And yet, ironically, we're probably at a stage today where there has never been wider recognition of the potential contribution of the culture and creative industries to jobs and income generation at a time when many developing countries face youth bulges and the arduous task of finding gainful employment for many young people. There are, of course, many other ways that culture can drive development. In terms of education, many countries have increased the numbers of people they're educating, but there's still issues of the quality of education. Integrating culture into education is one way to address the issues of quality. In urban development, rapidly urbanizing developing countries are grappling with the tensions arising from social exclusion. So that points to opportunities for harnessing cultural infrastructure, for instance, to provide meaningful spaces that bring communities together. Lastly, in terms of development aid to confront the climate emergency, the arts can play a key role in amplifying the indigenous knowledges that many developing countries possess, offering us new pathways for shifting towards greater balance with nature. This is potential that is currently being insufficiently tapped.
Thank you so much. Such an important issue, and obviously, to state the obvious, 0.23% is incredibly low. Hopefully, that figure can be addressed in the coming years. Now, Juliana and Biggie, we know that data collection is done because it helps us better tailor policies to the realities and needs of the cultural and creative sector in a given country. Juliana, in the case of Uganda, the Global Report highlights efforts to increase the amount of local content in broadcast media through a 70% quota. This is a joint effort of your ministry, the Uganda Communications Commission, the National Association of Broadcasters, and the Uganda Film Commission. What can you tell us about the results achieved so far in that collaboration, and how has it improved cooperation between the media and cultural professionals, and to what extent?
Thank you very much. So far, the results are promising. We've seen a great number of broadcasters showing a lot of content of cultural expressions, both on television as well as on radio and in the newsprint. And we've also seen new initiatives coming up on television stations which did not have any content before. We believe that with the establishment, for example, of the Chibanda Express is a streaming platform. A lot of content which was not there is now being shared, and it has reached over 10,000 people. A lot more needs to be done. And the other bit was the challenge of data. MTN Uganda was able to support and have zero streaming data for the Chibanda Express, for example. In terms of improvement, we've been able now to move positively. We have been able to have programming of culture programs strategically on a number of platforms for broadcasters, and this runs every week for at least 4 hours for the last 6 weeks, as well as the sessions that we had in July 2021. But we also have artists now signing contracts with the broadcasters, which was not the case before. And this has helped them to get remuneration. And thirdly, they are commissioning works for artists and therefore improving on the quality to enhance the movement of goods and services outside the country. Thank you.
Great to hear about the fruits of your success there with artists actually signing new contracts. Thank you very much, Juliana Okoyo. Biggie Samwanda, in 2019, Zimbabwe adopted a new 5-year cultural and creative industries development strategy. How did the consultation and policy monitoring dynamics involved in the development of Zimbabwe's national reports inform the development of that strategy?
Thank you so much. We have been growing dynamically, if you ask me, in as far as involving what I would call if I'm to quote from the current strategy that is being launched today, to involve and bring what they are saying, the whole of government approach. But we also took this concept of the whole of government approach and took it out to the civic society, to arts practitioners, to arts associations, to so that we would garner what we would call participative approaches to formulating policy. And this aspect, which was drawing from the National Arts and Culture Heritage Policy that was launched in 2019, meant we're moving a step further and involving civic society organizations into it, bringing in women organizations, bringing in women creatives, bringing in the Ministry of Women and Gender and other ministries that deal with culture, whether it's cultural heritage in its tangible form, or IKS, as Yari was talking of, indigenous knowledge systems. Bringing all these on board meant the dynamic of what we had learned in our first quadrennial report was coming to influence the development of policy, and what's also coming to influence the monitoring of the policy framework that was in place. So the cultural and creative industry strategy looked at matters that UNESCO and the SDGs have at their core in ensuring that there's diversity of cultural expressions. You wish to know that these consultations for the National Cultural and Creative Industry Strategy has seen the development of support coming from government, because the input is coming from the stakeholders themselves. And what we now see is what the stakeholders are saying from their multi-sectoral dimension is being inputted into what we now have as the National Development Strategy, which is a 5-year government plan, which is putting culture at the core of development. So
Biggie,
to us,
thank you very much. I'm sorry to cut you off. We're over time. You're an absolutely fascinating insight again, and great to hear about the efforts to ensure that women are properly represented in cultural and creative industries, something that we're so passionate about here at UNESCO and in this report. It's a big theme. Salwa Dakhalek, le rapport mondial souligne que seul...
Salwa, the World Report underlines the fact that only 35% of the surveyed countries have recent data on the access to digital media. Digital media tend to remain concentrated within world platforms. Can you tell us how the International Center for the Digital Cultural Economy responds to this challenge, and how is it working in order to rise up to this challenge? Well, thank you very much. The International Center in Tunis is not an observatory that collects data, but we're trying to do things in another way. We have different projects that are being implemented by different startups in the cultural and creative industries, and we're really trying to help these startups. And they're focusing on cultural content using artificial intelligence. They're really trying to use artificial intelligence and deep learning. And thanks to these mechanisms, we managed to collect data. And of course, we're trying to have access to big data, and that would enable us to use modern technologies and understand better cultural and creative industries. So what we're doing is helping startups implement their projects because these startups are trying to collect big data. So this is how we do. And this is a bit like working in a lab in the center because we've been working on digitalization of heritage and try to combine artificial intelligence. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Salwa. That was very interesting. Thank you very much, all our panelists.
To Juliana Akoyo, this question: can you tell us more about the time and financial resources invested for the process made in Uganda to mobilize stakeholders?
Thank you very much. A lot of time was invested in terms of coordination, reaching out to people, and we can't estimate exactly the cost of the time, but a lot of it was put in place. In terms of the resources, many of the stakeholders, like the different government agencies, contributed to ensuring that they put resources towards collecting information under their mandate. Again, we did not put this into compilation, but everybody did the best they could to have the information collected. What is evident is the report that we are able to submit in terms of the participation of all those people that you saw in the report of Uganda. Thank you.
Juliana Akoyo, thank you very much. Time for one final additional question to Salwa Abdelkhalek. Qu'est-ce que c'est qui a poussé la Tunisie à créer?
What encouraged Tunisia to create a center for the digital economy? And what did you do to address the lack of skills in the digital economy? Well, there is not necessarily a gap in terms of digital skills. In fact, there is a lot of potential in the digital field. However, perhaps what's lacking is an awareness around the importance of the cultural economy, not the digital economy, but rather the digital cultural economy. In the field of cultural and creative industries, we are a unique governmental institution that works to support and incubate startups who are leading cultural projects in the field of the digital economy, which are innovative. And the aim is to showcase the importance of these projects and the digital cultural economy. Thank you very much, Salma Abdelkhalek.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. A really vibrant discussion. Now, this discussion showed that knowledge production is essential for informed and responsive policies that meet the needs of artists and cultural professionals. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the vulnerability of creative workers while demonstrating the essential role of culture and creativity for our individual well-being and that of our societies. The crisis has underlined the need to reshape policies for creativity. It has also underlined that culture is a global public good for the benefit of all. And this is the subject of our second panel, which is about to begin. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the music during the break. I certainly did. It was written and performed by Lady Ma Keita, whom we are lucky to have with us here today in the second panel. So let me start by welcoming our sixth panelist this time. First of all, Dr. Hilma Farid. You are the Director General for Culture at Indonesia's Ministry of Education, Culture, Research and Technology. Next is Peggy Hicks, who is the Director of the Division for Thematic Engagement, Special Procedures and the Right to Development at the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Next, Ma Koudia Keita, as I just mentioned, is a musician and activist living and working in Senegal. Next, we have Alette van Leur, who is Director of the Sectoral Policies Department of the International Labour Organization. Next, Laura Martinez Silva is Director General of Cultural Industries and Arts at the Ministry of Culture of Peru. And Martin Secil, Deputy Director General for International Partnerships at the European Commission. Thank you, all of you, for joining us today. So we'll go straight into questions. The global report, Reshaping Policies for Creativity, comes at an interesting moment when the role of creativity for society and its value for our economy and daily lives is to some extent being rethought. Because during the pandemic, when lockdown measures were applied, the role of creativity at generating and maintaining social cohesion was clear for all of us to see. So we haven't got Marku Diakite. We were going to go to her now, but we're going to go on. This is a live event, so sometimes connections don't work. That's the way of the world these days. So we'll go to our second question, Alette van Leur. The International Labour Organization is sending out a clear message in this report. More efforts, it says, are needed to ensure social protection for all cultural and creative workers. So how much is the cultural sector suffering from under-regulation? What improvements are needed in the creative professions to bring them up to ILO standards? And are there any measures that would specifically target women creators?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting the ILO to participate in this important panel. And also congratulations on the release of the global report, Reshaping Policies for Creativity. Your questions are very interesting, a bit challenging to respond in a short period of time, but I will make an effort. Okay, sorry. Yes, I hope you can hear me. Okay, as the report reveals, the culture and creativity economy accounts for a staggering 6.2% of global employment, which is really quite an impressive number. And it's also one of the youngest and fastest growing economic sectors in the world. And culture, creativity and entertainment are among the sectors also hardest hit by the pandemic. We have heard that in the previous panel also, and we have seen that in your reports, which has resulted in enormous job losses, but also losses of income. And apart from the devastating impact of the pandemic on the sector, it has also revealed very clearly the pre-existing vulnerability of the sector. And that's largely due to the nature and the organization of the work in the sectors, as well as the types of what we call contractual arrangements. The sector often is marked by freelancers. Many people work in the so-called gig economy, or in employment relationships with one or multiple employers, temporary employment, very short periods of time even, and part-time work. And this is what we call in ILO insecure forms of work, or even more neutrally, diverse forms of work. And some argue that there's also benefits to these diverse forms of work, and that there are also positive sides for people, such as flexibility, which would include flexibility for creativity, of course, and also allowing for a better work-life balance. But the large diversity in the sector and also its diverse composition make it very difficult for countries to regulate the sector, and that has clearly a negative impact on the protection and also labor protection and conditions of work. So we have revealed in ILO research that the decent work challenges, as we call them, that are common in the sector are low income, job insecurity, insufficient or non-existent social protection, as you rightly stated, and also little or no access to benefits, which are normally reserved for other workers. So what improvements are needed to create jobs, decent jobs in the sector, to bring them up to ILO standards? Well, as I already highlighted.
Sorry, Alette van Leur, I'll ask you to be very quick. 15 more seconds. Sorry to be so strict.
Good. I will go straight into it. Expanding social protection coverage is one of them. And then the jobs created in the sector should be decent jobs. Governments should help to make sure that the fundamental principles and rights at work are applied, and also help transition from the informal to the formal economy, and workers in the sector should have a voice at work and enjoy freedom of association and participate in social dialogue processes.
Well done. Thank you very much. A very quick summary there to finish up. Thank you very much. A really important subject, of course, the vulnerability of artists and how that can be addressed. We're going to go back to Marc Koudiakita, who is now with us. Bienvenue. Merci.
Bonjour, welcome, Marc Koudiakita. What have these past 2 years taught you about the value of your art and your place in society as an artist in the music industry? Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. As you know, these past 2 years have been very unusual, with a global health crisis, a pandemic that has impacted a number of different sectors, and particularly the cultural sector. It has affected us particularly on an economic level, because in our sector, we need to interact with people. We need physical contact with our public. And this crisis has forced us to rethink how we communicate with people, remotely, for example, using the internet. We've been able to rethink these ways that we communicate and to think of new forms of expression. We've adjusted to the situation. However, there are challenges in terms of economic issue. Many people have lost their jobs. I'm a musician, and many of my fellow musicians weren't able to pay their rent. They had to sell their instruments in order to afford it. And we didn't receive much help from the government. There wasn't much appropriate financial support that was able to meet the needs of musicians. So in a way, it helped us to better communicate our needs to the various institutions and to rethink our policies for communication, but also in terms of how governments can better support us. Thank you very much, Marc Koudiakita. It's essential to hear from an artist in this discussion.
Irene Khan, the current UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of opinion and expression, wrote for this report, "Art is not optional, but essential for the fulfillment of the potential of women and girls. The global commitment to gender equality and development cannot be met if female creativity is ignored." From a human rights perspective, how can policymakers ensure that all creative capacities, including those of women and girls, are nurtured and can contribute to these global commitments?
Great, thanks so much for the question and for this really important panel and report. Very glad to be part of it. As we've heard from so many of the other speakers, societies cannot thrive and develop their full potential if they don't harness the value of their diversity or fail to foster the creative potential of their members. Women and girls, of course, are more than 50% of that creative energy. And so we need, as the Global Monitoring Report says, real efforts to increase their presence in the creative sectors and to address the challenges that still remain to their achieving gender equality. We find from a human rights perspective that there are a couple of steps that need to be taken in that regard. The first thing, of course, is that in all the programs and policies that we bring into fostering creativity, they need to incorporate a really strong non-discriminatory approach. What we find is that even if it's not intentional, although sometimes it can be, we see potential barriers that exclude people that are more marginalized or don't have access to some of the vehicles for the creative expression that the policies may promote in one way or another. And that can really affect people who, for example, live far away or have different ways of life or live with a disability. But obviously, of course, its impact on women and girls is quite profound in many societies and places. So what we want is for an approach that really sees these policies as ones that need to invest in a whole chain of conditions that will allow any person who's aspiring to grow into a creative role to have the opportunity to do that. And that means We need to look at their access to places and materials for their education and the development of their capacity, and for them to be able to access the creativity of others and the information and resources that they get to do that. We need to make sure that they can participate in an array of practices and express their ideas in a variety of ways, and for them to be able to contribute to creative spaces, both private and public, where their ideas can be heard and respected. And we see that as something that needs to happen in a sustainable way. What we see, of course, are often one-off attempts to address some of these problems, but aren't integrated across the system in a way that can really address all of the barriers that women and girls and other people who may be marginalized in a variety of different ways may have, the barriers they may face in accessing and expressing their full creative potential. Thank you.
Thank you, Hicks. A really good insight. Thank you so much. A really important answer. Laura Martinez Silva, I turn to you because Peru has recently amended the law on performers to recognize the status of artists to professionals who previously weren't categorized in that way. So can you tell us a bit about the process of drafting this amendment and about the profile of people who will now benefit from this new legal framework?
Thank you very much for the questions. I am grateful for the opportunity to present Peru's experience to the application of the convention. The law has been in force for 18 years. That is, before the approval of the Convention of the Diversity of Cultural Expression, and also before the approval of the National Culture Policy of Peru, 2019. Therefore, its updating was urgent and depth with the artists in our country, which became more evident during the pandemic. We conceive the fulfillment of this duty as a process of citizen participation and consultation, and there are several outstanding aspects that I would like to share with you. Some of the things, work table and stall, were carried out using native language, such as Quechua and Shipibo, language from the Andes and Amazon respectively. This allows us to incorporate and make visible our rich diversity. We are clear that the law is not a matter of exclusive competence of Ministry of Culture. So we hold bilateral meetings with the most diverse state entities. Throughout the process, 1,183 people participate in the entire process, and we obtain 1,140 contributions, which were systematically processed. Ensure the transparency of the process, we publish all the information obtained at the website of the Ministry of Culture, considering their intermittency, independence, informality, and the multifunctionality of the artist's work, rather than defining a specific occupation and trying to name the vast diversity in the forms of work in the sector. We are proposing this to speak to the subsector and their workers in a broader way. For example, with regard to the music, performing art, visual arts, audiovisual, and publishing industry, we are now incorporating the activities and tangible cultural heritage, taking into account the intercultural approach.
Le pido resumir. I just asked you to finish up quite quickly, if that's okay. Hemos pasado el tiempo. Gracias.
Thank you.
Muy interesante. Muchísimas gracias a usted. Thank you very much. Very interesting. Dr. Hilma Farid, Indonesia's Cultural Development Index shows how the performance of culture for sustainable development can help to identify priorities for policy making, including at the sub-national level. So what have been the results of this approach on the ground?
Yeah, thank you. And let me begin with a bit of information about the Cultural Development Index itself. So the index was created back in 2019 to measure the impact of our interventions in the field of culture. It is an aggregate score of factors from school enrollment rate and literacy to social resilience and participation in artistic activities. Data has been collected through a survey of around 50,000 households throughout Indonesia and then presented at the provincial level. So now we know which province out of the 34 provinces in Indonesia have better performance and which ones does not. And this then generated a kind of competition, a healthy competition at that, between provinces, because nobody wants to be on the bottom of the index for sure. So what is also interesting and quite revealing is the fact that the amount of funding does not necessarily correspond with better performance. There are a number of other factors such as leadership, quality of human resources, the presence of strong civil society organizations, and so on. The index has been made public so artists, cultural activists, NGOs, and other interested parties can be part of the public discussions about our priorities, the types of intervention that we need to do, and so on. The index also helps government agencies, and this is, I think, one of the most important parts of the index. So it helps government agencies other than the Ministry of Education and Culture to define their role in cultural development much better. Before the introduction of the index, programs have been ad hoc at best, not really coordinated because there was no common reference, let alone measurement. So the index helps to provide a sense of direction in a way. At the regional or provincial level, the index shows that some provinces are quite strong in one aspect, but weak in others, and so on. So, and now we have a general agreement that there cannot be a one-size-fits-all solution and policy. Diversity is indeed very essential for cultural development. So this is probably the major results of the index and after the implementation in 2019.
Farid, that's fascinating. Great to hear about the tools which Indonesia has been using in this area. Indeed, culture is deeply linked to the challenges of sustainable development. The Commissioner for International Partnerships of the European Commission, Jutta Urpilainen, says in the report, green and digital transitions will require fundamental shifts in the way we think, live, work, consume, and produce. Yet again, culture will be at the core of this change. Martin Sechel, one paradox is that while culture is important for these transitions to happen, cultural actors are often not included in discussions on environmental or digital matters. What can government, civil society, and business do to change that?
Yes, thank you for the question. I mean, culture is, as we know, both a component and an enabler of sustainable development. And this is recognized in the 2030 agenda and also in our own EU policies. Especially, of course, in the area of international cooperation and development. And yet, as you have pointed out, cultural practitioners are often or rarely recognized. They're often excluded even from their contributions to political and economic priorities. I would say there is a tendency when discussing such global challenges to over-compartmentalize these discussions. And if we take the discussions on climate or digital transition, all too often the discussions happen between peers and experts, while these issues really concern us all. They concern all of society. Second point is that to really resolve these issues, we also rely heavily on innovation. Innovation will be at the core of society's answers to these challenges, and that also requires creativity. And we know, therefore, that creatives have a clear role to play in such fundamental challenges. But to do so, they need to have a seat at the discussion table, because through their art, they are also serving as catalysts of change towards more sustainable patterns of behavior and development. And we are working closely with our member states in the European Union to fully integrate culture into national development agendas through what we call our open method of coordination. And we have had very fruitful discussions on how we can maximize these interconnections. The link between cultural heritage and climate change resilience, for example, the link between culture and sustainable development goals on the other. I just want to highlight as a quick example, the new European Bauhaus launched by President von der Leyen last year, which serves as a bridge between the world of science, technology, art, and culture, cutting across disciplines and building on participation at all levels. The other point I'd like to make is that culture also gives us a very valuable bridge to invite young people to the discussion. And we know there's, young people are often very, very important part of the creative sector of society. They represent both the present and the future. And in a world with around 2 billion young people, obviously, this is something we cannot fail to do. It is really important to strengthen the partnership with youth. This is why we've named 2022 the European Year of Youth, and we are really actively engaging to strengthen youth participation and empowerment.
Martin Seccio, I
it's all about
apologize.
connecting people, and culture is at the heart of that, of course. So really, it's a fundamental issue.
Brilliant. Brilliant to end on youth. So important always to bring young people into any discussion. And it's a reminder that the cultural sector is intertwined with so many aspects of our daily lives and relevant for economic thinking too. So again, let's bring in Ernesto Ottoni. What really needs to change, do you think, so that we really seize this opportunity to reimagine the cultural ecosystem, as you mentioned in your speech, for sustainable development?
Je vais mettre un exemple. Je viens d'arriver ce matin.
Let me give you an example. I arrived this morning and I came back from Iraq. In the last 3 days, I was in Iraq, in Baghdad and in other cities. And we work with the European Union in Baghdad as well as in Basra, and we're trying to implement what we're trying to re-energize cultural life. Because what we see is that we have a tendency to implement cultural projects in an obsolete way. Cultural projects are sectoral projects, and they're here to reach objectives. We add buzzwords, young people, women, we add words. But what we don't see is actions taken on the ground to change the situation for local communities. When we talk about culture, we're talking about creating jobs, we're talking about economy, we're talking about the development, the economic development. The social aspect completely disappears. It is struck out. But today, when we talk about cultural diversity, it's the basis of our society. It helps us for social cohesion. It's what makes the difference. In some countries, you have a huge difference between the part of the society which have access to the capital and the majority of the population encounter problems when it comes to access to health services or other services. I think the time has come to think about culture as being part and parcel of sustainable development. And people working in these sectors need to be sure about the fact that they will be able to develop further within their society. So I think we have to stop talking and we have to start acting and implementing cultural policies. When you're asking us, what should we change? Let's take a look at the ecosystem. The ecosystem as it exists today is unfair. The way things work in today's ecosystem is not right. There are different channels that we have to use to come up with solutions. Now, today, and I'd like to continue what the last speaker said, if we don't have an intersectoral thinking, science, economy, of course, social aspects, but we have to be connected to the different needs of the society to build a harmonious development of society. If we don't do that, we will fail. So that is what we have to try to do. We have to rethink cultural policies and we have to change, to bring about change. And based on the experience that we can see on the field, I'm even more deeply convinced of the fact that if we want to reach our sustainable development objectives, we have to change the way we work when it comes to cultural issues.
Rather than something which should be cherished and supported. Now we're going to go to our second round of questions. I'd ask all our panelists to be a bit shorter this time. Brilliant answers. I hate having to interrupt people. So you've got a minute and a half, more or less, for each answer. I know it's difficult to cram everything in. Please try your hardest. Por favor, lo más corto posible. Muchas gracias. Laura Martinez Silva, diversity is part of what gives Peru its vibrancy. For example, the Ministry of Culture has invested in the skills of cultural professionals in local communities to retain talent and has also simplified procedures to increase the number of community radio and TV stations. How are these efforts integrated into Peru's development plans?
Thank you. Taking it as a priority, an example is the design of the recovery plan for the cultural and arts industry for 2013, a document that includes objectives and strategies in the process of being implemented for the reactivation for the sector after the impact of the COVID-19 in Peru. We undertook a process of elaboration of the plan that was participatory and attends to our diversity. We convene native community, holding dialogue tables in native language, Quechua, Aymara, and Yanisha. It was a revealing experience since it allows us to measure to our diversity, make their needs visible even more to offer the pandemic. It is important to highlight the technical assistance that we have received from the UNESCO office in Peru, which has accompanied us through the process. On the other hand, it was the dialogue table in sign language, which was particularly significant. We understood another dimension of our cultural diversity, that of the non-hearing. In the recovery plan, we incorporate as goals to make visible the population of region outside of Lima, the native, Afro-Peruvian population, and people with disabilities. Likewise, the objective of achievement, gender equality, make visible the participation of women in our creative and cultural sector.
Laura Martinez Silva, muchísimas gracias. Really interesting to hear about how you protect local indigenous languages in a country like Peru in this context. Now, as Laura Martinez Silva mentioned, diversity is an issue that needs to be addressed strategically. Even when a diversity of expressions exists, they still need to be made visible. But who manages who is listened to, seen, and what influences that? Let's bring in Alette van Lieu. Now, we know that freelance workers represent a higher proportion of the cultural workforce than in other sectors. What is the impact of that on people's ability to develop a professional career in the cultural and creative sectors?
Thank you so much for that question. I will try to limit this to 90 seconds. I first would like to say something about the concept of a public good, culture as a public good. COVID-19 has underlined the relevance of the cultural sector, and we have already seen that and heard that today as well. But it's also so ironic that while workers in the cultural sector became essential for communities, many have suffered so much throughout the pandemic. And that particularly relates to freelancers and those outside what we call the standard employment relationships. So what is of crucial importance is the recognition of the professional status of workers in the sector. In many countries, workers in this sector are not even considered workers. So they cannot claim rights, and they do not have rights to social protection, occupational safety and health rights, but also a voice in dialogue processes. And for us, social dialogue, freedom of association, collective bargaining are essential for the realization of decent work in the sector. So without this voice, these workers in the sector cannot address issues like labor rights, formalization, working hours and wages, and so on. And we haven't been able to touch upon that, at least not in my earlier responses. Gender equality is so crucial, and particularly also in the context of violence and harassment, which is quite common, unfortunately, in the sector. And so for us, the basic bottom line is labor protection for cultural workers should be brought in line with the protection that workers in other sectors enjoy. And so basic social protection and even a minimum wage in the sector should be seriously considered. I hope that this was within the 90 seconds allocated. Thank you.
Very much so. Thank you very much. And really a powerful message to end on. Thank you, Alette van Lieu. Nurturing and maintaining the diversity of cultural expressions is, of course, beyond the means of any single country, and it requires that culture be considered as a global public good. The report offers numerous examples of extraordinary results achieved through international cooperation in the cultural and creative sectors and industries. Martin Secel, the report states that only 0.23% of development aid is allocated to culture and recreation, as we previously heard. But in 2018, 7 of the 10 largest donors were EU member states. In the words of the Commissioner, Jutta Urpilainen, since 2016, the European Union has invested more than 100 million euros in cultural and creative industries, intercultural dialogue and cultural heritage in partner countries. How is the European Union investing in diversity, directly or indirectly, through international initiatives?
Yes, thank you. I mean, the European Union is itself a model of diversity, of course. Our motto is united in diversity. And through this motto, we recognize the richness of the EU's cultures and languages, but also the fact that we are stronger together. And this is indeed at the heart, I would say, of the EU project. The fact that we've managed to create over 60 years a partnership of very different countries while preserving and promoting national competences and differences. Just like to make a couple of quick points that follow from that. First of all, we very much believe that cultural diversity, human rights, and fundamental freedoms are intertwined. They're all necessary ingredients, and you cannot have one without the other two. And as such, these are core principles on which our entire policy framework are based. This interconnection is also recognized, for that matter, in the 2005 UNESCO Convention on the Protection and Promotion of the Diversity of Cultural Expression. Second point is that cultural actors need democracy and respect for fundamental freedoms to thrive. Cultural ecosystems cannot develop, they cannot flourish if the cultural sectors are conditioned by censorship and intimidation. Unfortunately, we see this happen all too often in many parts of the world. And finally, cultural diversity cannot exist without freedom of expression and respect of human rights. Intercultural and interfaith dialogue, for that matter, cannot take place without safe spaces where fundamental freedoms and rights are respected. So our work to support cultural actors is very much interlinked with our work to promote human rights. I would say it is actually two sides of the same coin. And really, this is a very important characteristic also of our work in this field. Thank you.
Martin Secel, thank you very much. A great reminder that fundamental principles that we all believe in are at the heart of this. Hilma Farid, Indonesia has been a leader in advancing the creative economy agenda at a global level. At the national level, the government has pursued a number of initiatives to make the creative economy a thriving and strong sector. Could you tell us more about how these initiatives complement one another in developing an integrated cultural and creative sector?
Well, yeah, thank you. I think one of the most important initiatives is about institutions and visibility. So, because for decades, Indonesians have been involved in craft production, fashion, cinema, etc., and all of which today fall under the category of creative economy. But it was never considered as such. Everyone was pretty much working in isolation, so there was a problem of visibility, really. And due to this somewhat amorphous nature, there was also no focus. Government intervention was very much confined to particular projects, but there was no general policy on how to best facilitate the development of the different subsectors that form the creative economy sector. So the establishment of the Agency for Creative Economy in 2015 was a very important step because it provided a platform for creative people and creative communities, government agencies and businesses to develop cross-subsectoral collaborations. For example, food meeting film, fashion and performing arts, and so on. Today, creative economy has become an important sector with a contribution of no less than 8% to the GDP. Three most important and thriving subsectors are fashion, food, and craft. And our office, the Director General of Culture, supports particularly the fashion and food subsectors by bringing our rich biocultural heritage into the picture. For example, the use of indigenous knowledge of natural fiber and natural dyes for textile products has great potentials. And the same applies to the food sector. We have been encouraging projects on sustainable food production, using indigenous knowledge and the use of vernacular cultural resources. And all this, I think, opened up new possibilities at the local level for different social groups, including, for example, otherwise marginalized indigenous women and young people. And in the last few years, we have also developed different platforms from which important creative economy initiatives will be launched and developed. One of the platforms is our Pekan Kebudayaan Nasional. It's a national cultural festival that brings together almost all stakeholders to discuss and showcase their projects. It's much more than a festival, really. It's as it allows participants to form what one may call a community of practice, a place where people share knowledge, experience, and learn from each other and to work together.
Great to end on that note, to hear about a cultural festival in your country and the contribution it has, and that figure of 8% contribution to GDP from the cultural creative sectors really stands out. Thank you. Indeed, the report emphasizes the crucial role of collaboration between UN agencies, governments at the international level, between institutions in any country, and between civil society and the private sector. It seems that the secret ingredient is often listening to one another and sharing common goals. Peggy Hicks, the UN 2020 Call to Action for Human Rights, the highest aspiration, as it's termed, states that the space to exercise the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion is shrinking. How does the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights see the impact of this trend on the right of everyone to take part in cultural life?
Thanks very much. And it really is something that we're extremely concerned about. And I think it's come through many of the statements so far, where the ability to participate, to join in the cultural life is essential, but there are lots of barriers to it. And all human rights and freedoms are really interdependent and interrelated. So when we have a negative impact in one place, it affects others. So for example, when we see spaces limiting the rights to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, or the right to freedom of opinion and expression, those are the same spaces that we need for participation in cultural life. And those spaces for cultural interaction is where we express and confront and build our opinions. It's where we express the diversity of the world of ideas, and we expose ourselves to values, beliefs, and question and challenge the norms of the societies that we live in. So when those spaces start to shrink, it also means that our ability to express diversity also shrinks. So this is something that our office and those we work with are extremely concerned about. We live in a place, as we've heard from many of the panelists, where cultural life is not only underfunded, it's under threat, as are the people who express themselves in this space. So we are working with many organizations and individuals to really document these growing challenges to freedom of expression and to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion globally. And I really want to emphasize that the shrinking space trend has a new dimension in our digital age. And that means that online space is both essential for expression of rights, and we heard that specifically from Ma about the challenges when we haven't been able to engage in person as much. We need to be online, but we also recognize that the online space is a place where freedom of expression and thought can be risky, can give rise to threats and challenges. So we really need to join together to defend that space. Thanks.
A really important point to end on. Thank you, Peggy Hicks. Really great answer. Ma dernière question sera pour vous, Ma.
My last question goes to you, Ma Kudia Keita, because we would like to hear from an artist like yourself what it means to you to talk about culture as a global public good. Well, as an artist, I believe it's our duty to value culture, to showcase the culture of our country at a global level, because culture allows us to sell our country, to showcase it. For example, in the case of Senegal, it's not to do with the turnover of our companies. That's not what shows the value of a country. Musical standards allow our culture to be showcased at global level. Music can show the history and the values of our country and allow our country to be identified. So I believe that it's our duty But it's also the responsibility of organizations and institutions working in the field to do everything they can to showcase this, to ensure that we can share the values and the culture of a country through its culture. Thank you very much, Makuja Keita, for your reply and also for your music and your activism.
Merci, and thank you to all of you for keeping to time. We now thankfully have time for a couple of questions at the end from members of the audience, people listening on various platforms. Now, first question is to Peggy Hicks. Do you feel it may be necessary that artists have meaningful representation and participation at the United Nations, either through an arts envoy office, a working group, or a special advisor to help create UN-wide strategies? That question is to Peggy Hicks. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Joel, and thanks for the suggestion. I mean, I think we've heard all the ways that arts can be brought into our lives more effectively. And I think we in the UN need to take notice of that as well. I'll leave to my colleagues in UNESCO and elsewhere who have looked at this issue in greater depth, which particular mechanism is going to give the greatest space and voice. But I think we should really be looking at how we can make sure that the findings of this report are brought into the work of the UN, not just on a one-off basis, but on an ongoing basis, as the question suggests.
Thank you very much. It's a really fascinating question and probably one that my colleagues in the culture sector here at UNESCO will ponder. Makuja Keita, the second question, la deuxième question, c'est pour vous. Quel changement attendez-vous?
The second question goes to you. Which changes are you expecting from the law on the artist of Senegal from 2020? And how can artists push for effective implementation of this law, particularly in the informal cultural sector, which is predominant? Well, indeed, our sector is much more informal than formal. What we'd like to see are cultural initiatives, perhaps more events, more shows. Unfortunately, this isn't the case at the moment. Our country is very rich in terms of culture, but there are not many cultural initiatives that really bring together all of the artists nationwide. And these types of events could create jobs for musicians, not just as musicians, but also as initiators, as employers, as employees and organizers of these types of events. We also need to foster music education in our country, because if you learn music informally, then you can't expect musicians to then be able to organize themselves in a formal manner. So I think we have to start from there. We need to ensure formal music education among children. And we also need to launch more events which will allow us to work as musicians and organizers of such events. I don't know if that was clear. Yes, it was very clear. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much to all of our panelists. A really, really interesting discussion. The first panel, brilliant, and the second panel, up to the same standard. Really, really interesting topic here. And it feels right, obviously, to bring you, Ernesto Ottone, back into the discussion. As we prepare for the World Conference on Cultural Policies and Sustainable Development in September of this year, Mondiacult in Mexico, what is the sort of big thought that you're taking away from this discussion today?
If you allow me. Je vais paraphraser une personne de notre équipe qui travaille.
I'd like to quote someone from our team who works here at UNESCO. The other day, we were discussing this report and the importance of providing the data that everyone has been requesting. And we realized that over the past 40 years, we've been building culture. a building which involves different floors, windows, doors, and every time there's been an issue with this building, we've called the firemen to save a floor, for example, or to carry out repairs. But the problem is that with this global crisis, which is essentially an earthquake affecting all buildings worldwide, the building hasn't collapsed, but it's cracked at all floors. So either we continue building and making the building heavier with the risk of it eventually collapsing, or we take a look at the foundations of the building. And if the foundations aren't solid enough, then we rebuild them. And this effort must be constant, lasting, and collective. What the event in 2022 will do is to culminate in a number of different conferences on cultural policies that we've held over the past few years. And it's the result of the participation of cultural ministries in the G20 with the leadership of Indonesia. And Mondiacult 2022 will take place in Mexico. We are expecting commitment from the 123 ministries of culture, but also we're expecting a change in our cultural policies to ensure data that provides information, that provides solid foundations so that we can face the years to come. First of all, we need to start listening to creators, to artists on the field. We can't continue implementing top-down policies. Secondly, employment is essential. We cannot continue with this situation in which cultural workers are in precarious situations. Third, we can't wait another 20 years to bring together cultural ministers. We need to create spaces for social transformation and dialogue. And lastly, these reports mustn't simply be shelved. They must serve to develop cultural policies and social policies, but especially cultural policies, which are at the foundation of all societies. And lastly, I'd like to quote Keita, who mentioned this earlier. In history, the names of creators are long-lasting, and I think that we need to focus on these.
Before we say goodbye, we are going to have a quick video to give us a flavor of Mondiacult 2022. A great flavor there, really, of Mondiacult 2022. Thank you once again to all of our panelists, Dr. Hilma Farid, In the second panel, Peggy Hicks, Marco Giacchetta, Alette Van Leur, Laura Martinez Silva and Martin Sechel, and of course to our first panel. We had some great discussions today. Thank you to Ernesto as well for being here. And thank you for the team behind this report in particular. They've worked incredibly hard on this. And of course, thank you very much to the government of Sweden for making this flagship global report possible. Here is the report, Reshaping Policies for Creativity. You can download it online. There are links available on a special website set up for the report. It's available in English, French, and Spanish. Enjoy reading it, use it wisely and creatively, share it with your friends and colleagues, and goodbye. Early. Better early than late.